Chapter of the book of Revelation to a very interesting prophecy that few people have taken the time to examine, but has, I think, some tremendous messages for us. Because in this chapter we have predicted a movement that God says is going to arise at a certain time in history. We're going to look at the identifying marks of that movement. And then we're going to look in history to find out, did that movement come when God said it would? But first of all, notice who's giving the prophecy. Revelation 10 and verse 1 says, I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud. A rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. John sees this mighty angel. Now this is interesting because it just doesn't say it was an ordinary angel. It was the mighty angel. Now the word that's translated angel actually means messenger. And what this says is this mighty messenger from heaven comes down. And again, it's no ordinary messenger. It's the mighty messenger. And by the way, this word mighty or almighty is used primarily in reference to God. So who could this angel be? A real angel? Or could it be God himself who comes down with the message here? It helps if we would take a look at the description in Revelation chapter 1 of the one who's giving the book of Revelation. Verses 15 and 16. Now, by the way, who is giving the book of Revelation to John? Who's the book of Revelation all about? It's about Jesus. Now notice verse 15. It describes Jesus in his heavenly ministry. Verse 15, and his feet were like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. And his voice is the sound of many waters. And he had his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword. His countenance was as the sun shining in its strength. Now, hear that description, and it's clearly there he's describing Jesus. Now in Revelation 10 and verse 1, notice again, I saw this mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, rainbow upon his head. His face was as it were the sun. His countenance as the sun in Revelation 1. His feet as pillars of fire. In Revelation 1, his feet as if they burned in a furnace. There's tremendous similarity between the description in chapter 1 and the description in chapter 10. Now it's helpful if we realize that throughout the book of Revelation, this has been a common occurrence. For example, throughout chapter 2 and chapter 3, John kept pulling from the description that he gave in chapter 1 to let the people know that through every age of the church, Jesus is still speaking to them. And when we get down to Revelation 10, he's trying to give his people the assurance that even in the end of time, the same one who began the revelation is the same one who comes with this message for his church. So it appears that the mighty messenger here is none other than Jesus Christ. The descriptions are so similar that it makes very strong impressions that we're dealing with the same person. And to me, that's tremendous assurance, because it tells us that Jesus is vitally interested in what happens in this chapter. Now, what's this chapter all about? This mighty messenger comes down from heaven, described there, then verse 2. It says he had in his hand a little book, and that little book was what? Open. Now, if the book is open, that indicates at one time it must have been closed, but now open. That's strange words. An open book. And he set his right hand upon the sea and his left foot on the earth. A little book open. Indicating at one time there's a book that was closed that now is open. Well, it's not the book of Revelation. The very word revelation means an unveiling, a revealing. Revelation was never shut up, but there was one book in the Bible that was shut up. What book was it? Book of Daniel. Turn with me to Daniel 12 and verse 4. And notice as Daniel ends his little book with these words. Daniel 12 and verse 4. Page 1320, Daniel 12 and verse 4. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and do what to the book? Seal the book forever. How long is it to be sealed? Till the time of the end. Many will run to and fro, and knowledge will be increased. Now Daniel is told here as he ends his book that he's to shut the book up. It's going to be sealed until the time of the end. So in Revelation 10 and verse 1 comes, and it says the little book is open. And if that little book is the book of Daniel that was closed, what time are we dealing with? Time of the end. So the movement described in Revelation 10 must happen at the time of the end. Now remember, we learned that after 1798, that 1260-year period, the Bible reckons all time after that is the time of the end. So sometime after the Dark Ages, in the biblical time of the end, this movement is going to come. The little book of Daniel is going to be open. Now we also saw something else earlier, and that is that not all of Daniel was sealed. No, Daniel 2 was clearly understood all down through the ages. The part of Daniel that was not understood were the time prophecies. You know, the 1260 days, the 2300 days, these great time prophecies, they were the ones that were locked up. But it indicates that at the time of the end, they're going to be unsealed, which would thereby indicate that the movement described in Revelation 10 not only arises at the time of the end, but it deals with the unsealing of the time prophecies of the book of Daniel. Now, let's go on. In verse 2, it says he set his right foot upon the sea and his left foot upon the earth. We found the earth to be a symbol of our country, the United States. We found the sea to represent the teeming multitudes of Europe. And so if we were to take this in the symbolic sense, it's simply saying that in Europe and in America, this message is going to go. Or we may look at it another way and say by land and by sea, around the world, this message about the unsealing of the time prophecies of the book of Daniel is to go to all the world. So either way you look at this, it's talking about a worldwide proclamation of the message about the unsealing of the book of Daniel. Verse 3, he cried with a loud voice as when a lion roareth. And when he cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices. And when the 7 thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write. And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not. Wouldn't you like to know what the 7 thunders said? So would I. But that's all it says about them. They were spoken to John. He heard it. He was starting to write down. We'd have another whole prophecy of the 7 thunders. But then the angel puts his hand over and says, no, John, don't write that down. I've showed it to you, but don't write it down. It's covered up. What does that tell us? In something regarding this movement in Revelation 10, something is hidden from their view. God revealed it to John, but then God seems to cover it up and not write it down. I say, that would make a lot of sense. It will before we get done tonight. But something is hidden from the view of these people that are involved in this movement about the unsealing of the time prophecies of the book of Daniel. Verse 5. And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, and sware by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer. But in the days of the voice of the 7th angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God to be finished, as he has declared to his servants the prophets. So the angel now says, raise his hand and says, there shall be time no longer. Now, does it mean it's the end of the world? Not really, because the next verse, verse 7, says that through this movement, the mystery of God, the gospel plan of salvation, is revealed to the whole world. And in verse 11, it says, I must prophesy again before many peoples, nations, tongues, and peoples. So it's clearly not the end of the world. There's too much preaching going on after the angel says there shall be time no longer. So look at the context. What's he talking about? The unsealing of what? What book? Daniel. What part of Daniel? The time prophecies. That's the context. The unsealing of the time prophecies. And the angel says there shall be time no longer. In other words, when the movement of Revelation 10 takes place, we come to the end of all the biblical time prophecies of the book of Daniel. There shall no longer be any more time prophecies. All of them will have been fulfilled when this movement comes. There shall be time no longer. Now, the longest of those time prophecies is the 2300-day prophecy, which we found ended in what year? 1844. In other words, this is telling us that at the time that this movement of Revelation 10 arises, we will have come to the end of those time prophecies. It must arise then sometime around 1844. Verse 8, "And the voice which I heard from heaven spoke unto me again, and said, Go and take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel, which stands upon the sea and upon the earth. And I went unto the angel, and said unto him, Give me the little book. And he said unto me, Take it and eat it up, and it shall make your belly bitter. But in your mouth it shall be sweet as honey. And I took the little book out of the angel's hand, and I ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey. And as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter." Interesting words. The angel says, "Here, take this little book and munch on it. And in your mouth it's going to be sweet as honey. But when it digests, get down to the belly, it's going to turn bitter." Now, what does this mean? Does this mean John literally was eating a book? Does it mean that this movement in Revelation 10 ate the book of Daniel? I mean, that's the little book. It's the little book of Daniel. And they ate it up. Now, if I went up to you tonight and said, I went home last night and I just devoured that book, would you think I ate it? Now, you know what I meant. I got so excited about reading this, I couldn't put it down. It was so exciting to read. And that's what I think this is talking about here. They just ate it up as they began to understand the time prophecies of the book of Daniel, and they came to their understanding. The Bible said they just ate it up, and it was in their mouths as sweet as honey. Isn't it exciting to understand the prophecies? As you've gone here night after night and you've understood these great prophecies, it indeed has been a sweet and blessed experience, sweet as honey to the mouth. But then notice what it says. When it gets digested, it turns what? Bitter. That while it was a sweet and blessed experience to understand the time prophecies of the book of Daniel, yet they were to go through a bitter disappointment over these time prophecies of the book of Daniel. And then notice verse 11. "And he said unto me, Thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings." From the ashes of their disappointment, they would arise again and go into all the world with the message about the book of Daniel. Now, these are strange characteristics. A movement is to arise sometime in the 19th century, mid-19th century, after the Dark Ages, around the time the last of the time prophecies are fulfilled in 1844. That movement's to deal with the unsealing of the book of Daniel. It's to go by land and sea around the world with its message. It would be a sweet and blessed experience to them as they understood it, but then it would turn bitter after a bit, and then they would arise again and go into all the world with their message of the book of Daniel. Now, that's the prediction. The question is, did such a movement that meets these specifications arise when God said it would? Remember, folk, when God says something's coming, will it come? Absolutely. Bank on it. It will come at the time God said it would come. The teaching of the second, and tonight I want to just share with you the story of the movement of Revelation 10. Because you see, for centuries, the second coming of Christ was looked as something far off in the distant future. Even Martin Luther, the great reformer, said, it may come 1,000 years from now. It was never looked upon as imminent. And the reason for that was when you get to the early 19th century and the late 18th century, most Christians were what they called postmillennialists. Now, what that meant, it's a big theological word that simply meant that most Christians thought there was going to be this great 1,000 years of peace and prosperity on the earth, and at the end of that time, then Jesus will come. So the second coming wasn't near because we hadn't got to this time of great prosperity yet. So everybody looked at the second coming as way off in the distant future. Nothing is imminent. Now, I know that goes in the face of everything that Christians believe today, because most all Christians today are what we call premillennials. They believe, as we saw from the Bible, that Christ is going to come before the 1,000 years, not after the 1,000 years. But that's not the way it was 200 years ago. And so it was that beginning at the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century, all of a sudden, people from different denominations around the world began to emphasize the soon return of Jesus. And again, understand that the church has always taught Jesus is coming again. What is unique here is that this time, as we approach what the Bible calls the time of the end, at the end of 1798, for the first time we have people start talking about the coming of Christ as near. There was a Roman Catholic priest by the name of Manuel de Lacunza down in Chile who began to preach that Jesus was coming soon. But probably the biggest movement took place on the European continent, in England and on the continent. A movement that was primarily among the scholars and the educated people of society. What happened in Europe was they began studying intensely the time prophecy of the book of Daniel, late in the 18th century. As they figured the 1260-year prophecy out, they said, if we're reasoning correctly that a day stands for a year in prophecy, then something's going to happen to the papacy in 1798. Because that's when that prophecy ends. And so as they approached 1798, they did so with wondering eyes, wondering, was this their understanding of the prophecy going to prove true? And sure enough, in 1798, the Pope was taken prisoner, ended the political power of the Pope, and it confirmed with those scholars in Europe that what the Bible said was accurate. They found the key to understand the book of Daniel, that a day equaled a year in these time prophecies, and now they saw its exact fulfillment. As a result, many preachers in England began to preach the soon return of Jesus. They began focusing on the next great prophecy, the 2300-day prophecy, and they figured out that was also going to end sometime in the mid-19th century. Some said 1843, 1844. They were pretty close to that year as we've seen it. And this is all over Europe. By the year 1820, there were 300 Church of England clergy preaching the soon return of Christ based on a fulfillment of the time prophecies of the book of Daniel. And 600 of the nonconformist clergy. Some of the great names that some of you may have heard of, Joseph Wolff. In fact, Joseph Wolff became so convinced the second coming of Christ was near, in 1826 he made a trip to the United States, spoke before a joint session of the Congress of the U.S. There's no far-out preacher here. But spoke before a joint session of the Congress of the U.S., proclaiming that Christ was going to return again sometime around 1843 or 1844, based on the understanding of his understanding of the 2300-day prophecy. Henry Drummond was another one preaching the soon return of Christ at this time. In Scandinavia, where all preaching contrary to the state church was prohibited, God raised up little children to proclaim the message. And kids 7, 8, and 10 years of old were out there preaching the soon return of Jesus and explaining the 2300-day prophecy to people. Now, I grant you that 2300-day prophecy is not the easiest prophecy to understand. And when you have children of 8 and 10 years of age explaining this and preaching it, you clearly have a movement that obviously God is leading here when even little children are proclaiming the soon return of Jesus. You see, the Bible says when God has a message that's going to be given and the men refuse to give it, the very stones will cry out and give it. And when it came time for God's message, it happened. Here in America, or I should say in Europe, it was primarily among the educated and the scholars that the movement took place. But here in America, it took a popular turn. The leader of the movement on the soon return of Christ and premillennialism in America was a man by the name of William Miller. Now, William Miller was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1780, of Baptist parentage, moved in his early years to Lowhampton, New York, where he grew up, but became an educated man, a man as most people did in those days, by reading library books, not with formal education. He was never trained to be a preacher. He was a farmer. But as he got older, with all his reading, he became a skeptic. And ultimately, he became a deist. Now, a deist in those days believed that God created the world and then God took off to let the world run itself. And God had no more intervention in the world. And William Miller became a deist. And then along came the War of 1812, and William Miller enlisted in the war, fought in the war, And all around him he saw the carnage of war and the people dying without hope and without Christ. And when he came home, he began to attend the Lowhampton Baptist Church. He was not converted, but he began to attend that Baptist church on a weekly basis. Now, in those days, in small towns like that, the church didn't have a preacher. Instead, what they did is they got up and read a sermon every Sunday. And since Miller was one of the most educated people in the community, they would ask him now to read the sermon. But since he was unconverted, the elders made certain they chose the right sermon that would speak to his heart. And so he got up and preached this sermon, and he was speaking to his own heart, until ultimately William Miller ended up giving his heart to Jesus Christ and joined the Lowhampton Baptist Church. Now he had to deal with this problem. All his friends were deists, and they began to taunt him. They said, "Miller, you believe that Bible now?" And so in order to meet the scoffing of his deist friends, Miller began an intensive investigation of the Scriptures that was to last for the next 15 years. Now he decided on a very basic principle of interpretation. He took his Bible and Cruden's Concordance, and that's it. He refused to read anything else. He said the Bible is its own best interpreter. That's not a bad plan. So with his concordance and his Bible, he began working his way through the Bible, trying to understand the Bible. Now you can imagine the prophecies particularly interested him. Why? Because if he could show how the prophecies were fulfilled exactly, that would prove to his deist friends that the Bible was true. And that's why he was engaging in the study. And then he came to Daniel 8:14. Under 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And using these basic methods of interpretation and letting the Bible interpret itself, he started figuring it out and came to the conclusion that prophecy was going to end sometime around 1843 or 1844, just like the scholars had done over in Europe. Now, he wasn't alone in coming to this conclusion, even here in America. It was Archibald Mason, for example, in Scotland, who taught the 2,000 days were going to end in 1844. Alexander Campbell, the founder of the Disciples of Christ movement, also taught the 2,000 days was going to end in 1844. So these people were not alone in teaching that Christ was going to come sometime in the mid-19th century. There were people all over the place teaching these kind of things. And it was revolutionary teaching because they were saying Christ is not going to come at the end of the 1,000 years. He's coming before the 1,000 years. That was revolutionary teaching for the church. And so Miller came to these same conclusions. He didn't read these men. He simply came to these conclusions totally on his own, independent. And what I find fascinating is how when God is leading sometimes, people independent of each other arrive at the same conclusion at the same time. Now, one problem. Miller departed from his principle of interpretation. What's the principle of interpretation? Let the Bible explain itself. And he did it with everything else, except when he came to, under 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And according to what most all preachers taught in his day, the sanctuary was this earth. Rather than investigate what the Bible said about the sanctuary, Miller accepted the popular view that the sanctuary was this earth. So when he read 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed, then shall the earth be cleansed. Well, it's going to be cleansed by fire of the second coming. Therefore, this must say at the end of the 2,300 days, the second coming of Christ is going to take place. Now, can we overlook for a moment the date setting? Because the contribution that William Miller made was not the date setting. It was the truth of the pre-millennial return of Christ. And that's at the heart of what he accomplished. And all of us, whatever our denominational affiliation today, that believe in the premillennial return of Christ are indebted to William Miller. He's the one in his movement here that helps Christianity make this switch. That is the lasting contribution of William Miller to theology. And it is major. Now, he made a mistake on the date setting. We all recognize that. But to his mind, it seemed quite clear. And as he continued to study this over and over again, he kept coming to the same conclusion. He'd share it with a few friends, but he wasn't a preacher, he was a farmer. By the time you get to about 1830, 1831, the conviction begins to weigh on him very heavily. That if you really believe that Jesus is coming in the next 15, 20 years, then certainly the world ought to know, needs to know about it. What are you doing to tell everybody? And that impression weighed on him so heavily that one day he got down on his knees and he prayed and he says, God, I feel you're calling me to do this, but I don't want to do it. I'm a farmer. I'm not a preacher. Find someone else, Lord. But the impression continued, and finally he says, all right, Lord, I'll make a deal with you. By the way, it's not, be careful when you make deals with the Lord. He's down on his knees saying, Lord, I'm making a deal with you. If you send somebody to ask me to preach, I'll go. Now he felt pretty secure. Nobody had ever asked him to preach. While he's still on his knees, a knock comes at the door. He goes to the door and he opens it up. There's his nephew, Irving Guilford, standing there. Uncle William, the pastor over at the Dresden Baptist Church, is sick this Sunday, and they sent me over here to invite you to come over and preach and share what you've been studying from the Word. Miller was dumbfounded. He's down on his knee making his deal with the Lord, and already his nephew's on his way with the invitation. But still he doesn't want to go. He walks out to the grove behind his house where was his place of prayer. For the next several hours he pled with God to be released from this burden. But there walked into that grove a farmer. There came out of that grove a preacher. And Miller accepted the invitation. And that next week, the people were electrified by the message that he presented. It wasn't long before invitations began to pour in from all over New England and upstate New York, inviting Miller to come and share with them what he was studying from the Word. Miller would only go where he was invited. And he was invited by churches of all denominations. This was a totally interdenominational movement. Even though Miller was a Baptist, his message was not given only to Baptist churches. He gave them to Methodist churches, to the Christian Connection, and all the major denominations that existed there in the mid-19th century. But mainly it was in the small towns. Upstate New York, northern New England, wherever he was invited. 2 years later, after he started this, in 1833, on the nights of November 11th and 12th, there occurred that great meteoric shower known as the falling of the stars. And here Miller had been preaching Jesus is coming soon, and then occurred that great celestial sign that we're entering the day of last things. And it gave tremendous credence to Miller's message. It was shortly after this, they met a preacher from Boston by the name of Joshua V. Himes, who was pastor of the Sheldon Street Temple in Boston. And Himes came up to Miller after the meeting one night and he says, Miller, do you really believe what you said tonight, that Christ is coming soon, before the 1,000 years? He says, absolutely. Then what are you doing to warn the big cities? What about Boston, Philadelphia, and so forth? Miller said, well, I've never had an invitation to go there. I only go where I'm invited. Well, Himes said, you've got an invitation. Come preach in my church in Boston. So Miller went to Boston. And that began Miller's ministry to the large city. And so now the movement moves out of the small towns and into the big cities. Joshua V. Himes becomes the first of what ultimately is between 1,500 and 2,000 preachers of all denominations who joined Miller in the proclamation of the Advent near. And the movement began to grow by leaps and bounds. They would go into towns and hire the biggest hall in town and fill it 7 times a day. It was electrifying the whole community. The message that Jesus was coming again, that Jesus was coming soon, that it wasn't way off in the distant future, it was near, possibly in the mid-19th century. As this movement continued to gain momentum, no device was neglected for spreading the message. They even had little gum stickers they put in envelopes saying, Jesus is coming. So when you got your mail, you saw it. They had charts, they had periodicals they published. In fact, the historian has said this, as early as 1842, Second Advent publications have been sent to every missionary station in Europe, Asia, Africa, and America, both sides of the Rocky Mountains. The commanders of our vessels and our sailors tell us that they touch at no port where they say that this proclamation has not preceded them, and frequent inquiries respecting it are made of them. So in 10 years, by 1842, the movement had spread around the world. There was no place on earth where the sailors were going, where people weren't asking questions about the soon coming of Christ. And periodicals were being sent around the world concerning the advent near. Up until this time, the movement had been extremely interdenominational, led by Baptists primarily, but a lot of Methodists, people of the Christian connection, those major denominations, but it was interdenominational, and the churches of all denominations would invite the Millerite preachers to come in and share their message with them. However, by about 1840, a change takes place. Why, I'm not sure. Maybe they felt threatened because the movement was gaining such popularity and such strength. But the churches that had formerly opened their doors suddenly closed their doors and shut the Millerites out. And in the next few years, if you happen to believe that Jesus is coming before the 1,000 years, it was grounds in the Methodists, the Baptists, and some of those major denominations to be dropped from their membership, as the churches that had once opened their doors suddenly turned against them. Now that didn't stop them. The movement had gained such strength at this time that since they could no longer get into churches, that didn't seem to stop them a bit, because the churches were getting too small for the crowds. So they bought the biggest tent that had ever been pitched, seating 4,000 people. And they carried out in the next 2 or 3 years 125 camp meetings in which over 500,000 people attended, an average attendance of 4,000 people for every camp meeting. When you consider that the U.S. population was only 17 million at the time, that's 1 in every 32 people attended one of these Millerite camp meetings. This was no movement down in the corner. This was a movement that was shaking America to its very core. One of the greatest religious revivals that swept across the American frontier there in the early 19th century. So in 1842, they formed what they called the Second Advent Association. Since the churches had rejected them, they had to have their own organizational base. And they began to issue the call of Revelation 18:4, "Come out of her, my people." And people by the thousands began to leave their churches and become part of this Millerite movement. Now at first they set no specific date for the second coming. They simply said it would happen sometime in the Jewish year 1844, which went from, they said, from March 21st, 1843 to March 21st, 1844. No specific date. But March 21, 1844 came and went, and the believers experienced their first major disappointment. However, that didn't stop them. Why? Because the movement was not founded on excitement, but on Bible study. They said, some of them, we made a mistake. And so they went back into the Word to find where they had made the mistake. They recalculated everything, and it just kept coming out the same. And they could not come to a conclusion as to why they had not seen the fulfillment of their hopes. It was at a Millerite camp meeting on August the 12th, 1844, where a group of Millerites were meeting together trying to find the answer to the disappointment. Why Christ hadn't come when they thought he would come. Then one of their number, a man by the name of S.N. Snow, Stephen Snow, began for the first time to link the sanctuary of Daniel 8:14 to the sanctuary of the Jews in the Old Testament, and made the suggestion that since in the Old Testament sanctuary, the sanctuary was cleansed on the 10th day of the 7th month, then wouldn't it be logical for the sanctuary to be cleansed at the end of the 200 days to happen also on the 10th day of the 7th month, which that year would be October 22? And suddenly it began to hit them like a bolt of lightning. That's why. Christ is going to come October 22, 1844. And from that meeting in Exeter, New Hampshire, they went out and began to share it everywhere. Christ is coming October 22. They'd settled on a date. Again, people by the thousands joined with them. William Miller said there were about 50,000 believers following on October 22. However, Miller happened to be a person that greatly underestimated crowds. And later historians have revised the figures quite a bit upward because they said Miller just was, he just didn't want to portray things better than they were, and so he was extreme on the other end. And that today historians tell us that somewhere between 150 and 200,000 people were devout, ardent followers of William Miller on October 22, 1844. And at least 1 million people half-heartedly expected the Advent to occur on October 22. That's out of the 17 million people in America. That's 1 in 17 people. That's a pretty extensive movement that happened over a 15 to 20-year period. When October 22, 1844 dawned, the Millerites met, some in homes, some in open fields, some in churches, to wait for what they felt was the last day on planet Earth. The day before they said goodbye to their friends, said, "See you in the kingdom tomorrow." All day long they waited. Maybe it's going to be at noonday sun, maybe at setting sun. It wasn't until midnight they finally realized that Christ was not coming. How bitter the disappointment, because they really wanted to see Jesus. The hope of the Advent had been such a sweet and blessed experience, just as Revelation 10 had said, sweet as honey to the mouth. But now how bitter the disappointment when he did not return. As a result of the disappointment, the Millerite movement broke up into various factions. But out of the confusion that existed after that, ultimately there came forth two major groups. Number one were what were called themselves the Advent Christians. Advent Christians were the larger body of the Millerite movement. When they organized in 1848, they organized with 50,000 people. That's the bulk of the Millerites. Miller was a part of them. Joshua V. Himes and others were a part of what became the Advent Christian denomination. They were the major group that followed Miller. However, today they number less than what they had at the beginning. And they've ceased to be a major religious movement in the world. The other group that came forth from this movement was the Seventh-day Adventist Church. You see, the great disappointment wounded, but it didn't destroy the hope of the Advent. The date was right, the event was wrong. Miller never saw that. He then kept his faith in the Advent till his death in 1849. And finally he issued a statement which he settled on another date, and that is today and today and today. By the way, Seventh-day Adventists have never set a date for Christ to come. This was done by the Millerites, who were primarily Baptist. But out of that emphasis ultimately came the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In 1848, when the Advent Christian formed with 50,000 people, the group that ultimately became the Seventh-day Adventist Church was the very smallest of all the Millerite factions. It numbered 300 people, that was it. The smallest of all the groups that came out of the Millerite movement at that time was what ultimately becomes the largest movement today, numbering over 13 million people. What happened? Well, come with me to Port Gibson, New York, to the home of Hiram Edson, who had a farm on upstate New York. October 22, 1844 came. Hiram Edson met with some other believers in the area, praying for the Lord to come, waiting for the Lord to come. And when he didn't come by midnight, Hiram Edson and some of the others went out to the barn behind his house and spent the rest of the night praying. God, we don't know what's happened, but Lord, give us understanding. Help us to know. We felt your leading in this, but we don't understand this disappointment. By morning, they finally felt encouraged. And so they began to to walk across the cornfield to visit a farmer nearby that they knew also would be greatly disappointed, and they wanted to encourage him. And as they're walking across the cornfield, all of a sudden Hiram Edson began to think. An impression came to his mind, the sanctuary, not this earth, the sanctuary is in heaven. They turned around, they made their way back to the house, they opened up their Bible and began to study the Bible on the sanctuary question. And there in the morning of October 23, 1844, they began for the first time to understand that the sanctuary was not this earth, the sanctuary was heaven, and that what happened on October 22, 1844 was not to be the second coming of Christ, but that Christ is beginning that third phase of his ministry in heaven, the great judgment day, when it's going to be decided in favor of God's people. A few months later, after the disappointment, they wrote their view out in a little paper called The Day Dawn, what they discovered, and they sent it out to various Millerite people. Among those who received this pamphlet was a man by the name of James White, another one by the name of Joseph Bates in New Bedford, Massachusetts. As they read it, they became convinced too that this was light. That explained the disappointment. The event was right. The date was right. The event was wrong. Now come with me to another town, Washington, New Hampshire. In Washington, New Hampshire, there was a little group of Millerites that were meeting there. And as they were meeting in that little church in Washington, New Hampshire, expecting the Lord to come and before the disappointment, among them was a woman by the name of Rachel Oakes Preston, a Seventh-day Baptist, who was while she was meeting them, she still was a little reluctant to join with them because she says, before Christ comes, you've got to come back to the Sabbath. And one Sunday, the preacher got up, and they're about to have communion. And the preacher made a statement in which he said, if anybody is knowingly planning on sinning, they ought not to participate. Dear Rachel nearly jumped out of her seat. The preacher noticed it. He went to visit her the next week. He says, I noticed what you did. She said, yes, because you're not keeping the Sabbath. That ultimately led to an intensive investigation of the seventh-day Sabbath among these Millerites in Washington, New Hampshire. And just shortly before the disappointment in 1844, that group in Washington, New Hampshire made the decision to begin keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. And that's why that little church in Washington, New Hampshire is recognized as the first Seventh-day Adventist church in the entire world, where the truth of the Advent and the truth of the Sabbath came together for the first time. After the disappointment, one of their number, T.M. Preble, wrote a little tract on the Sabbath and sent it out again to various Millerite believers. Among those who received this tract was Joseph Bates, the same one who received the tract on the sanctuary message. Joseph Bates then becomes the key player to unite the sanctuary message in with the Sabbath truth. And that's why Joseph Bates is looked at as one of the key pioneers of the Adventist church. As Joseph Bates read the tract, he said, I think the brethren in New Hampshire have some truth. And so without stopping, he made a journey all the way from his home in New Bedford, Massachusetts, all the way up to Washington, New Hampshire, arrived there late at night, knocked on the door, and the brethren invited him to come in, and they spent the whole night studying the Sabbath question. He didn't want to sleep. He wanted to know the truth. By morning, he was convinced. And there's no need to stay any longer. He made the journey back to New Bedford. And when he was crossing the bridge from Fairhaven to New Bedford, one of the brethren happened to be crossing the bridge at the same time. They says, Brother Bates, what's the news? And he says, the news is the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. And Bates declared his acceptance of the Sabbath truth. In 1846, a couple years later, James and Ellen White visited Bates, heard him preach about the Sabbath truth. At first they thought he erred because he emphasized the Sabbath more than the other 9, but it led them also to study the Bible on the question of the Sabbath. And they too accepted the truth of the Sabbath from the Bible. And of course, in December of 1844, as we saw last Tuesday night, Ellen Harmon, who became Ellen White, received the spirit of prophecy. And thus, these early believers, numbering, as I say, by 1848 only 300, began to meet together in various prayer meetings. where they would meet together to study the Bible. It says, if we've been wrong on so many items, maybe there's other things we're wrong on. They come from different backgrounds. Some have come out of the Baptist church, some out of the Christian community, some out of the Methodist church. They come from all these different persuasions. But they've been united on the Sabbath truth and the message of the soon coming of Christ. And they study the Bible to find other truths of the Bible. Many times, because they come from so many different persuasions, they become locked with one person believing one thing and another, and they couldn't seem to arrive at a meeting of the minds. And they finally get down and they plead with God, Lord, give us understanding of what your word says. And there on their knees, they discover the great truths that we've gone over together in the last 5 weeks. And as they studied, they came to Revelation 10. And they read about that little book of Daniel being opened, and sweet as honey to the mouth and bitter to the stomach. And they suddenly realized God had foretold this whole movement. This whole disappointment was hidden from view with the seven thunders. But then they came to verse 11. And they read their marching orders. You must prophesy again before many peoples, nations, tongues, and people. And all that seems so impossible. How could they? They were so small. They were penniless. They just had faith that God was leading. But they realized that if God was leading and this was his movement, it was a movement of destiny. It was a movement of prophecy. And God was leading in this movement. Then if God is for us, who can be against us? From that small beginning, they went out and began to share their message. By 1863, they had grown to only 3,000 people. So that's when they organized themselves as a church. But today, they have continued to grow until today they've built the earth. 13 million, the 10th largest Christian religious denomination in the world. One of the fastest growing religious movements on the planet. Why? What has moved this movement for over 150 years? It's because they realized, and we must realize also, this is not just another denomination. This is not just another church. This is a movement. A movement of people who are committed to the Word of God. This is the message that God has given in these last days to prepare people for the coming of the Lord. When they realized that God was leading and God was guiding, this was a movement of destiny. They were a movement. You see, denominations rust, movements move. And this is a movement. This is a church of the future. This is a church, not a church that glories in the past. This is a church that realizes that God is leading and God is guiding it into the future. To give the final warning message to the inhabitants of planet Earth. You see, that's a strange way to start a church. Through a disappointment. Yeah, it is strange. Except that's the way God seems to always work. When it came time for God to bring out the Old Testament church out of Egypt, he sent Moses down, and Moses thought he was going to go in with a mighty hand, and suddenly Pharaoh would let them go, and oh, how great Moses would appear. And the people were told they had to make bricks without straw, and they turned against Moses. And Moses had to spend 40 years in the wilderness before he was humble enough to realize that God could use him. You see, if the people hadn't gone through that disappointment, they would have credited Moses with being a great leader. And when God leads movements, friend, he humbles them into the dust first so they realize that what's happening is of God and not of humans. Likewise, when it came time to begin the Christian church, true to pattern, God did the same things he did with the Jewish church. They expected that Christ was going to come and be triumphantly accepted, and his disciples would suddenly take over the world. And instead, he ended up on a cross, and they went through a bitter disappointment. And only as they got humbled through the disappointment could God then use them to establish the Christian church. So it should not seem strange. And when it came time for God to start his last day movement, he did the same thing he's always done. He let them go through a human disappointment, so that out of the ashes of that disappointment they would realize that this is a work of God and not a movement of humanity. But God is calling out a movement today, folk. A movement of people all around the earth who come together on the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. A movement centered and rooted in the Lordship of Christ. A movement of all people. To give this warning message to prepare people for the coming of Jesus. And I'll tell you, folk, if I weren't a part of this movement tonight, you couldn't keep me from it for one more moment. God's leading in it. God has got it. God predicted this movement to arise when it did. It came. It's here. It's God's last day movement. Then can I invite you to become a part of this final movement of destiny? As Cynthia sings tonight again, friend, I invite you once more to get up out of your seat and come to the front and say yes tonight. I want to become a part of God's final movement of destiny. I want to be a part of this movement of prophecy, this movement that God is leading in these final days to prepare people for the coming of the Lord. I can't stay out of it because God's leading. God's led you here, folk. He's put his finger on your life in these meetings, and He's brought you into connection with this message at this time because God is calling you to be a part of this movement. You can't turn back, folk. Having seen the light of God's Word, you need to step out and follow that light. So will you come this evening? As Cynthia sings, step out and say yes tonight. I'm coming. I'm making my decision tonight to be a part of God's final movement of destiny. Will you come? Right now.